Welcome back to our Building a Great Environment where people can do their best work. We're going to increase the question and answer period at the end because that was a request that we had from the last session. I'm excited about that. And just so you know what we're going to be covering today, we're going to talk a little bit about dealing with below the line behavior. And I think this is often one of the most popular sessions because people feel like this is where they spend a lot of their time. We're going to talk a little bit about creating like a next play mentality, creating some self-coaching, getting ready for people to align their self-interest, and the dreaded when you do have to part ways with somebody. We're going to talk about that too. So we're excited to be back with you, and I'm going to turn it over to Brett to get us started.
All right. So last time when we got together, we talked about how to catch above the line behavior and why that was so important. And now we're going to learn, as Becky said, is how we're going to convert below the line behavior. And to get things started off, we're going to hear from Tim Corbin. And this is his philosophy on modifying behavior.
What you allow will come back either positively or negatively. And I just think the allowance of behaviors, good or bad, is really the setting of what's going to come forward.
And so that is the setting. And what we'd like to do is show you a football example, and we'll relate this back to business in some context.
Florida called for a personal foul. Misconduct by Kelvin Taylor. This was the gesture.
Okay, so just for everyone, basically what happened is he scores a touchdown, makes that gesture. That's an unsportsmanlike penalty. Referee calls it 15-yard penalty. So obviously undesired behavior. Here is how the coach handles it.
A vitriolic moment afterwards with his head coach.
Everyone's looking at him. So if we could, I would challenge everyone to pull up their chat and answer this question. What are the pros and cons of that approach inside the sport context? How would you answer that? And as the chat starts to roll in, Becky, what are some of the pros? What are some of the cons?
Well, first of all, to put this in a like kind of a non-sports context, you think about it. I mean, I've seen situations where, supervisors have totally gone off the deep end on an employee in front of everyone in a meeting, and what the effect that is. And I think when I think of the pros and cons of this, I think for sure the tone is set. We know that behavior is not acceptable, and everybody has seen that firsthand. The cons of that relationship between the coach and the player in this case, or the manager and the employee in another case, that might need a lot of repair after a situation like this.
And not only with the one that made the infraction, but look at all the teammates looking at it. What are they thinking, Becky?
Well, I think in this moment, they're probably thinking, I'm glad that's not me. But they are also thinking, that could be me. And I think that puts a difficult situation around that relationship too.
And so really that's what we're going to try and talk about today. And if I was going to ask you, Becky, if you were going to define this word, how would you?
I think I would think about it in terms of how to move quickly.
And so a lot of people define agility in different ways. So just think about how you would. The ability to move quickly, the ability to adjust, to pivot. And if we look at it in a social context, how would you describe that, Becky?
Well, shoot, like there are so many situations where like being able to pivot and make decisions on the fly become really, really important in everyday management.
And one of the things that I'd love for everyone to think about again is, what are situations that you had to police that needed immediate attention that caught you off guard? What are situations that you had to police that needed immediate attention that caught you off guard? That is really where social agility comes into play. And when you combine social agility with competitive maturity, the ability to be your best authentic self inside of high pressure environments, that is a required skill to coach at the professional level. Here's an example of that. This is Earl Thomas. He's in a contract year and he tears his ACL. He's frustrated with the coach, and this is what he does. Okay. Now think about if you're the coach in a stadium full of people and your leader, one of your very best players, does this to you where everyone can see, how would you handle it? And this is metaphorical, isn't it, Becky? Because this is obviously explicit, but there's a lot of people that do this in a more passive aggressive way.
I think we see that a lot. I myself was just in a meeting where there was something like this occurred, and it certainly wasn't to this point, but they were metaphorically flipping off the supervisor.
Because you see that, Becky, in the environment you work, there's a front office, so you get exposed to the corporate approach, but then you also have this primitive approach where it's such an emotional cauldron inside the athletic context. And so think about how you would manage that. This is Pete Carroll, the head coach, after the game when asked about it. And here's what he said.
Under the circumstances, to handle what just happened in a flash of a moment, and with all of the knowledge that he knew where he was going, he knows exactly what the injury was. He knew exactly, I'm sure it's flashing in his mind, this is going to take this long, and this time, how could this, all of the stuff that's going through his head. I mean, you got to give everybody a break. You can have expectations for people to do exactly as you would think they should do, but until you're there doing it and you understand it, yeah, you've got some room. And so that's exactly how I feel about it. I know that probably some of our other players know that, and people who've been in the situation understand. And I get it when people want to pass judgment and try to, cast aspersions and all that about something. But in the heat of the moment, with all the emotional part of this, and the injury and the pain and just all of that, I'll give the guy a break.
All right, so Devon, I'm wondering if I can invite you in. I appreciate you participating with the chat. When you see how Pete Carroll handles it, and then you think about how you would handle it, where do your thoughts go? Devon, are you able to unmute? If not, we can just throw it to Becky. Becky, how do you think about that?
I think it's a little different in this situation because he actually has to answer for this person's actions to the media immediately following the game. Luckily for us, in a lot of settings, we have a chance to, walk in our office, close the door and cool down a little bit and not have to face media and deal with it. But I do think that in this case, for him to kind of like not air the team's dirty laundry in front of everyone is a really mature way to handle this situation. Even if he is upset with the behavior, he's not bringing it into the public domain.
And I think that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Is one more thing. The guests have been given permission to speak. All right. Thank you for that. Becky, if we're looking at power tools and how we're going to define power tools, it's really using force to modify behavior. Okay, so it's forcing control. How do you think about power tools?
Well, I think it's pretty easy when you're in a situation where you are over someone to be able to use power tools. And I think it's a very go-to method for a lot of people. I think the problem is that when you're not in that higher situation, then how do you handle it when you're managing up?
And what's interesting is even if you're not managing up, what do you do to motivate the unmotivated, to modify behavior when consequences don't work? That's really what the NBA is in our world. And here's an example of that.
Think about the culture I came from, Duke, right? You're there early, you're there late. You dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. A first-class culture, and then you get to the league and your GM, Jerry Krause at that time says, hey, look, guys, we need to start approaching this game differently. We want everybody to wear a suit and tie on the bus before every game, mandatory. If not, you're going to get fined $15,000. So as a 21-year-old kid, that's a lot of money. Are you kidding me? And then the first day after he says that, you see your leader, your team captain, Jalen Rose, show up in a camouflage jumpsuit. And you're like, oh, okay, this is a rebellious team-like mentality. And he does it every day. And you start calculating, that's 15, that's 30, that's 45, that's 60, and it doesn't faze him. It's a trickle-down effect.
Becky?
That's a tough one because obviously the GM is trying to use power over his team by saying you have to wear a suit and tie. Clearly, one of the more important people on the team isn't buying into that at all. And now he's got a real problem on his hands.
And I would ask anybody that's listening to this video or live, if you'd like to type into the chat, what are some parallels that you see where you have someone who's trying to do the right thing as the manager, but one of the most important stakeholders inside the organization has behavior that defies and is counterproductive to what that manager is trying to do? And I think that's what's beautiful about the NBA is because if the GM, the owner, the best player, and the coach came and they all had to bring the idea of a solution to a problem, and every one of them said, hey, if you don't do this, I'm out. The coach is probably the first person to be out in that situation in most contexts. And so that's what we see with Brad Stevens, where he understands that he is a member of an organization. And this is his thoughts on that scenario.
Well, I mean, punishment generally is not a term that, I'm not a fine fan.
And so he doesn't like to do fines or issue fines because in a lot of times that $15,000 to Jalen Rose is pretty insignificant. And so the behavior is more detrimental than the fine is. And so here's what he tries to do.
But I'm not a big punishment person. We don't run sprints. We don't do any of that stuff. We just want intrinsically motivated guys who are trying to be the best they can be.
And so he's trying to foster intrinsic motivation. And you can't do that with power tools. It requires a different approach. And that is what we're going to call pro tools. And essentially what a pro tool is winning influence. And if you were going to contrast the two, pro tools, winning influence, power tools, forcing controls. And if you truly want to continue your upward mobility, the less you're going to rely on power, because eventually you're going to get to a place where you're managing people that are more powerful than you are. But because we've all been conditioned and socialized into a power tool system, Becky, that is college athletics.
Totally. I'm dealing with people who are 18 to 22 years old. And I have a lot of experience. I've been there a long time. Certainly I have the power in that situation.
And so what we're trying to look at is what are ways to convert below the line behavior without using power tools? How can we win influence? And so we're going to just look at a couple of these. And the first one we're going to look at is called coaching the next play mentality. And here's an example of that.
What a magical evening this was.
I've been a part of worse ones.
All right, so 4.6 seconds left. Butler has the basketball down on the baseline. You guys are down one. Let's see how this thing plays out.
To inbound the ball again for Butler.
Well, remember this, when Portland Lakers, they allowed him to throw it. He lifted his pivot foot. There's the pass. Watch this. He dragged his pivot foot. No doubt about it.
If they don't get an immediate steal, they'll have to foul.
Foul right away. Hope for a dramatic three. Oh, boy! Yeah!
The reason I love this clip so much is because it just shows the nature of the game. And if we can, I'd like to just show you guys those clips back and forth real quick. So I want you guys to keep an eye on Brad. Watch his reaction to the travel. How would you describe his demeanor?
Inbound the ball again for Butler. Don't remember this with Hillary Lakeman. They allowed him to.
Pretty calm. Can we agree with that? What would look like you were thinking about the next play? Now we're going to roll this last one. Keep your eyes on Brad as this play ensues.
He's going to hope for a dramatic three. Oh, boy!
What do you think when you see that, Becky?
You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the emotions on both sides of that, like to get really upset when the first thing happens, because that's a mistake that just you really don't want to occur at that point in the game. But then the elation of actually coming back and winning it. And he stays really steady throughout the whole thing.
And if you think about his example and you think about the crowds, they couldn't be more different.
And same with the example we saw with the football coach. I mean, that was a mistake as well, and clearly a very different approach.
And here's the challenge, I will say, with that football example, Becky, because you've lived in Gainesville, you saw there was at least half the fan base, maybe more, that praised the coach for how he handled that scenario.
Well, you know, it's funny that you bring that up, because not only does he get praise for the way he handled that, but then on the flip side, Brad Stevens is like, some people say, well, you know, he doesn't have passion, so he's just flatlined, like he doesn't have passion. So he gets some negative reinforcement for staying steady.
And if you think about the crowd, again, in a metaphorical way, there's pandemonium, there's chaos, both sides, outliers. So extreme failure, extreme success. And he's able to not let the outside dictate his inner approach to what's next. And that requires a lot of strength. And that's why the next play mentality is so critical. And that's what Coach K, who coined the term, is going to talk about.
The game is a game of mistakes. You're going to make mistakes in this game. It's too fast. No one's perfect, but you can't let a mistake lead to another mistake.
And so one of the things that we do with teams that we work with is we ask them, what are the predictable events that can happen that won't go your way? And you could do that same in any context, but here's an example of some of the events that the players talked about. And so we know that sports are emotional games with predictable events. And so how you navigate those really is what defines the team. And that's why this is so important. And that's what Coach is going to talk about.
You cannot do anything on the last play. In other words, someone who is always looking in his rearview mirror will never make the most of the current moment. And so the next play is the next moment. So why wouldn't you want to be at your best for the next moment?
And Becky, can you talk about this concept?
Yeah, this was huge. I actually talked about this in one of our last games that we played here in Orlando. We gave up a goal with like 25 seconds left before halftime. And when we came out to start the second half, we had a couple people who were still talking about giving up the goal 25 seconds before halftime. And that's a huge problem, because we're getting ready to start the second half, and clearly we're not focused on what's next. We're focused on what has already happened. And we had turned around and we lose that game.
And so how would you grade next play speed, Becky, in the front office portion of your job?
I think it's just like, okay, like it's the same thing. We have predictable things that could go our way or not. And once they don't, the question I would ask is, how quickly do we reevaluate, move on, get to the next thing? And it doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge that the mistakes have occurred. You just don't stay in that moment of it. You get to a space where you can have time to reevaluate when there's time to take that space.
And so that is why that's so important. So coaching the next play mentality is strategy one. The next is facilitating self-coaching. And one of the examples that I brought today was a coach asked for me to help one of his best players who was in a shooting slump. And this is a player that's on his way to being the best shooter in school history. And the things that they were trying were not working. And he just said, would you take a swing? And one of the core beliefs that I have comes from a quote that Jack Clark said, who's an incredibly successful rugby coach. He said, why guess when you can know? And so I sat down with the player and I just asked him, what's going on? And if someone was in your situation, what advice would you give them? And here's what he said.
You need to quit overthinking things. Start selectively listening to your circle. They're making you second guess everything the coach is saying. You know that you don't just bring value when you score. You do a lot of things to impact the game. When you listen to them, it feels like the only way you add value is if you score. This team needs you to be much more than a scorer. This team needs you to be a leader. When you're thinking about you, you're not thinking about the team, and they see that.
Becky.
Well, it's just such a great example of like what a coach or a leader might think is the problem isn't the problem, because a coach might think, well, we got to work on his technique and fix his shot, as opposed to what's between his two ears. And he's giving you the answer by giving himself advice.
And Becky, talk about the significance of this question.
Well, it's so funny because when we can distance ourselves from the situation and give advice to someone else, we do that all the time. But then if we don't take our own advice, who else is going to listen to us? I think this quote is really pertinent in this situation.
And one of the things that we believe is the highest form of management is putting people in a position where they can coach themselves. And the way we succinctly say that is creating a platform where you can coach you, because you have more context to your situation than we do. And if we're inquisitive and we can motivationally interview you around what's next, it's a lot easier because they have the answer inside inherently. Sometimes their answers just get drowned out by the extremities of the outside noise. The next one is aligning self-interest. And, it's interesting because if we think about how many people are motivated by self-interest versus the greater good, it's unbelievably tilted towards self-interest, unfortunately. But the transcendent leaders are able to be with the greater good. But the reason they're transcendent is because there's so few of them. And so what I've found is that self-interest is a much stronger force than loyalty. And that's something that Michigan State coach Tom Izzo is going to talk about.
I wanted everything because it was right for me. And I didn't spend enough time to understand what they wanted. And that changed really quick though. My first year, then I started realizing more meetings, get a better feel for what they want, have them explain what they want. So I'm doing it with them. I'm not doing it for me. And I think when you get in college, especially where you're hired and fired on wins and losses, you want to win, 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 win. But if you got a kid who just wants to play or just wants to be better, or maybe just wants to be a pro and doesn't want to win, you better figure that out quick and figure out how, as Judd Heathcote says, every good deal is a good deal for both parties.
Becky?
I think this is pro coaching because ultimately everyone's on their journey. And I think it's the same for people that you all work with. Some people want to be the highest salesperson. Some people want to be the next level manager. But figuring out what they want and helping them get there is going to create a really motivated person. And until you know that information, it's hard to create alignment because you don't even know what it is that they're looking for.
Amen, which just speaks to how important the relationships are in getting to know them. And so what I would challenge everyone to do as we're going through this, because we want to spend a lot more time in Q&A this time, is think about some of the problems that you're having to manage. And then what we can do is run some of those problems through some of these filters to see if you can't have some strategy around attacking these. The next one is developing middle layer management. And you can do that with 3 people or 300 people. Kelly Graves, who is a great coach at Oregon, is going to talk about that.
I would first talk to the senior leadership and say, hey, listen, I don't want to make a big deal of this, but we've got to get this person in line. We need her, and if we let this behavior go, then we're going to have issues.
So that's the first thing he does, Becky, when attacking undesired behavior. What do you think?
Well, I think it saves the bullets that the coach has to use. If you're always the one who's being the heavy, you're always the one sort of disciplining the situation, I think you lose your voice sometimes. And I think if you can involve other people in that situation, not to necessarily discipline people, but to get them to self-correct the behavior by influencing that person, it just saves your voice.
And one of the most iconic programs in all of sport in America is the Oklahoma softball team. And that's coached by Patty Gasso. Becky, maybe you can give some context to Patty for everyone.
Well, you could argue that Patty is the most successful female coach of all times. She's had a great program that's been consistent over a number of years. She's been probably the leading female in terms of salary. So she's a real leader in our field.
And one of the things that she tries to teach is what they call championship mindset. And they just won the national championship last year, but they were struggling. They have a leadership council, and what they found was their seniors, their veterans inside the team were very frustrated with the freshmen, the newcomers, because they had never lived in this world and they weren't interested in getting up to that standard. And so one of the things that I asked the seniors is, how have you managed that? And they talked about basically how they've tried to bully them into the standard, but they won't listen. And then I asked them to rank themselves on this. If you were going to rank how you've approached these people, how, scale of 1 to 10, much have they felt listened to? How much have you made them feel needed, cared for, and appreciated? Scale of 1 to 10 on all of them. And it was like they have never thought about leadership in that way. They've thought about it from a top-down approach. You tell them what to do and they do it. Becky, you've seen this on many of your teams.
Oh, yeah. I mean, over and over again. And to be fair, I think it's an outdated model to think that you can tell someone to do something and they're going to do it. But I think when you approach it in this manner, it's a good self-awareness tool for yourself. Like, are you listening to the people that you're supervising? Do they feel needed? Do they feel cared for? Do they feel appreciated by you? And so I think it creates self-awareness on your part, but also can create a huge relationship improvement if you are actually on the higher end of the scale with these.
And back to Brad Stevens, when he said he's not a fine pan or he doesn't believe in punishment, when we asked him, what is the best way to change undesired behavior for him? He said, I rebound for them. Because when you invest the sweat equity with the people, you don't even have to bring the conversation up. They see that you're serving them, trying to make them better. And then naturally they come with their issue, at which point you can then speak into that issue. I think that's a remarkable example. And then the last one we're going to talk about is just simply reteaching. And I think this is a beautiful example. A teacher asked her class to put those 5 words in alphabetical order. And one of the students did this. What can we learn from that, Becky?
Let's close the gap of interpretation.
Amen.
Like what we think are clear instructions to someone may not be.
And we have to realize, and like Sue Inquist said, Becky, we have to put a higher value in their perception, and we must meet them where they are. And PJ Fleck, who created How You, said the best lesson he learned at being a middle school teacher was 100 ways to teach the same thing. And I know that really resonated with you, Becky.
Well, it did, because I think a lot of times as a supervisor, we think we've told them before, why don't they get it? And maybe they haven't heard it because of the way we've told them. Maybe we need to reteach it. Maybe we need to look at a different way to teach it because it didn't resonate. But oftentimes we don't go there first. We go there to, we've already told them, how come they don't get it?
Amen. And so that is why the last strategy would be reteach, and then you just start the cycle over. And the question is that a lot of coaches ask is, when do you force control versus when do you win influence? How would you navigate that question?
That's a really interesting question, because I think there are times where you have to make those decisions that are more difficult and force control. But I think it depends on where you are in the relationship with that person, where you are in the cycle of the bad behavior. You know, somebody who's been a thorn in your side and has continued bad behavior, it might get to a point where you have to force control. But for me, I would always try to go to the win influence first.
And I think that's where Chris Peterson, who we've heard from a couple of times, said that his philosophy was win them over or weed them out. And the reason we like that is because he spent an unbelievable amount of time trying to win them over. But you can weed them out of a drill, you can weed them out of a practice, of a game, and then eventually a season. You have to figure out what works for you. That was really hard for you, Becky, to try and figure out when to cut someone loose.
Totally. I think, you know, most people have this idea that you can save everyone. I'm definitely one of those people. But I think it gets to a point where, when is that person really damaging the team and you're trying to save someone? So it's like that one person, their needs are superseding your entire team. Doesn't make it any easier to make a decision to weed someone out. But I love his delineation of this, where having someone leave your team is the ultimate, like that's the end, right? But at the same time, there's so many things you can do before that that allow some space for people's behavior to change. And I think that's where this philosophy sometimes gets looked at as sort of a all or none. And I think it's a gradient.
And that gradient allows there not to be a surprise at the end. And AD said the thing that would haunt him is if he ever had to have that conversation and there was any element of surprise inside of that. He would have hoped that that coach would have thought he'd done everything to try and get him there. And it was almost the coach self-selecting, hey, this isn't for me. Obviously, that's ideal, but that is the goal for that particular AD. One of the things that we wanted to try and do is fly through the content and spend an extra 10 minutes based on last time's session to address Q&A. And so I'm going to toss it over to Becky and she can curate it. If anybody has any questions on what we've covered today, how to handle a situation, we would love to jump in with you. Becky?
Yeah, so what we'll do is if you all could type your question in the chat, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on you and you can actually articulate your question out loud and we can sort of process through it. Because I think sometimes, like, asking a straight up question and there's not usually a straight up answer, especially when it comes with below the line behavior. And to me, this is, if you can effectively do this, if you can effectively manage below the line behavior, you become a very, very valuable manager. Because I think it's quite easy once you train your lens to think about finding the above the line behavior. That's what we talked about last week. But managing this below the line behavior, I think, is where a lot of people get snagged. So type your questions in the chat and we'll start hitting them. And looking forward to this part. This was the best part last time. So hopefully you all have some great situations. All right, we already got one from Juliana. Juliana, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Of course, thank you. Lots of great advice, so thank you so much. But if I remember correctly, everything that we went through, it was mostly on how to address any issues when they present themselves. I think it's very true for us right now, and I think it applies to a lot of the companies in our space, in tech specifically. A lot of people are recruiting right now out there. And I think, are there any warning signs that somebody who is looking to grow their team can look out for in candidates when interviewing that could possibly flag someone who could, turn out to be somebody with a below the line sort of performance?
Becky, that was your world. College athletics in America is a recruiting game. And so you have to front load a lot of the conversation to get to know as much as you can prior to offering them to be a part of your team. And then you really don't know what you're getting prior to. Do you want to talk about some of that, Becky?
Yeah, I mean, we're going through it right now, even with the pro team, because the draft is about to happen for us. And, we have to be very wise about the people we select, as not only the talent that they bring, but how do they fit into our culture. And I think, Juliana, the one thing I would say is that I think my number one question would be, are we being blinded by this person's talent to those red flags that you potentially could see? Because I think it's easy to see like, wow, like I see what that person can do for this team. And we don't ask those questions. And I would take it one step back further. It's like, what is your process for finding talent that aligns with what you're looking for? And are you really articulating that in a strong way through the process? Because in college recruiting, it's like a dog and pony show. Like people are putting on all these events and things to attract the talent. But one of the coaches that used to be right next door to me, who always used to say, if you're going to beg them to come, you got to beg them to stay. And that alignment, I think, is a really important part of figuring out these red flags.
And Becky, talk about how maybe date one versus 5 years into the relationship is a great metaphor for recruiting.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, like when you're on your first date, like you're always putting on your best behavior. You probably like bought a new outfit for the night, got your hair done. But then like year 5, you're like in your pajamas, eating Cheetos on the couch. It's totally different thing.
But how does that affect recruiting? Because I see so many coaches who they're one thing during the recruiting phase and they're a completely different thing when they're coaching them. And that conflict undermines trust.
Well, it not only undermines trust, but I think it sends a really mixed signal to the person. Like, so I've done all this to get you here and I've acted a certain way. And then you get here and all of a sudden the power tool comes out. So I've wooed you with my influence and then you've gotten here and I'm like, do this or else. And I think that is really problematic to the success of that relationship.
And one of the things that Chris Peterson, an American football coach, talks about is identifying OKGs, which is our kind of guys, our kind of gals. One of the things that Bill Belichick talks about is that you're going to try and have a mosaic, and the identity of your program, that's a DNA, that's the genetic code of your company, of your team. Can you deconstruct that DNA and put a value on the things that you're looking for, and then ask questions based on that? So I was just on a call with an NBA coach and a college coach yesterday, and the NBA coach loves Bill Belichick. That's like the coaching North Star for him, just because he's from that area, et cetera. And he asked the football coach, what do you think makes Bill Belichick Bill Belichick? And he said, it's unbelievable, man, because when we would have scouts in, they would just be asking questions to check boxes. And you could tell that that's what they were doing. So this college coach wouldn't give them much because they weren't really doing their job, but would have if they asked intentional questions. He said that Bill Belichick called him about 2 players, and this was Boise State. So they're not even a Power 5 program. And he was on the phone for 45 minutes asking questions that he's never been asked before. For example, if this guy lined up against this guy and they went 10 times, who would you pick? Or on your team, if it's 3rd down, who has to be on the field? And again, I just think that one of Chris's best lines, Chris Peterson, he said that people will tell you who they are if you just pay attention. And if you're your authentic you and you're paying attention, I think that mitigates some of the risk and helps give you the best chance. But the reality is that pressure creates abnormal behavior, and it's hard to know what that person is going to be like when stress is put on them. And so the more you can identify that inside the recruiting period or the acquisition period, I think is critical.
Yeah, Brett, I want to, while we're waiting for a couple more questions, I want to just go back to one of the behavior modification strategies and just talk a little bit about self-coaching, because I think this is, if you guys have had a little bit of taste of Brett doing this, especially on the Q&A last week, but the self-coaching part is so important, and asking the questions. And I'm teaching a class at UF right now, and part of the class is that they're trying to learn to teach to others. So I'm sure that a lot of the people who are supervising in this situation are in a position where they're trying to help others along the way. Could you talk a little bit about your process when you do that?
Yeah, Becky, can you just talk a little bit more? I'm going to grab something that I think will be very relevant to this conversation. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, I definitely will. So I think what Brett's going to talk about here is the ability to ask questions that take things deeper and deeper. And he is the best question asker I know. That's why I want him to share this with you, because I think that even watching my students do this, we are now into the second round of their presentations. And what they do is they take a person through an exercise on Zoom, film it, send it to me, and then we talk about it. And what's so cool about this process is that it allows them to be the facilitator and not share as much. And so that's what I think I want you to talk about, Brett, is like just some of the kind of the rules that you have for yourself when you're doing this.
Well, probably the most important, and this is a really good book. I don't know if you all have read this or heard of this book, but it's called The Psychology of Money. And literally the very first page of the first chapter, just like to read this excerpt. It says, here's the thing, people from different generations, raised by different parents who earned different incomes and held different values in different parts of the world, born into different economies, experiencing different job markets with different incentives and different degrees of luck, learn very different lessons. Everyone has their own unique experience with how the world works, and what you've experienced is more compelling than what you learned secondhand. So all of us, you, me, everyone, go through life anchored to a set of views about how money works that vary wildly from person to person. What seems crazy to you might make sense to me. The person who grew up in poverty thinks about risk and reward in ways the child of a wealthy banker cannot fathom if he tried. The person who grew up when inflation was high experienced something the person who grew up with stabler prices never had to. The stockbroker who lost everything during the Great Depression experienced something the tech worker basking in the glory of the late 1990s can't imagine. The Australian who hasn't seen a recession in 30 years has experienced something no American ever has. To me, Becky, first of all, before I get into it, when you hear that expert, what do you think?
Wow, I think how much we see things through our own lens, instead of thinking about other people's lenses and how different those lenses are.
And so one of the neat things that happened with the pandemic, I was on the road 20 days a month prior to that. And nobody that I worked with, they all have assistants that basically send their emails for them. And they weren't technologically savvy. And then Zoom came into their life and they were comfortable being filmed. So one of the things that developed is I would ask them questions, and then I would ask them to watch the recording again and reflect on their answers as if they were watching a different person. And that distance allowed them to see themselves with more clarity than, this is what they've told me, than they ever have before. And so really that is the platform for coaching you. And the only thing I bring is questions. There's this amazing fable that I just absolutely love. And it's about a monkey trying to save a fish. And the monkey went down and grabbed the fish out of the water to keep it from drowning and brought it up to the tree where it died. And to me, I think that's a wonderful example that we project our experiences onto someone that may or may not be in their best interest. And so my goal when I'm facilitating self-coaching is to remove myself from that and to only ask questions and to challenge their beliefs without disagreeing with them. In other words, providing a counterpoint, but not identifying with that counterpoint, because the minute you draw a line, you're no longer partnering with them in discovery and growth. It now becomes adversarial and they'll dig into their belief system even more.
Hey, Brett, but can I interrupt you here for just a second? Can you give an example? Because I think that's really powerful, but can you give an example of what that might sound like?
Let's do it right now.
Okay.
Set up the role play. What are you struggling with, Becky?
Let's say I'm going to talk about struggling with having to manage up in the situation I'm in.
And that might be kind of real, Becky.
Could be.
And so what are you struggling with?
First, I think the most important thing I'm struggling with is that there is an experience difference between me and the person who's directly over me, which with me having more experience. And I don't mean that in a like I'm better than that person way, but more in that I think I can see some things that they can't.
And what's the tension point?
The tension point is when I do manage up and provide some context or background or give advice, that it's very rarely taken. And then the problems continue to exist and they become my problems because now I have to manage them.
And what would be an example of that?
Like needing to over communicate in the time of a real problem and making sure that even if there's not something to update, we're saying, hey, there is no update right now, but this is what we expect as a timeline, instead of there's just silence.
So I'm going to ask you to pretend that our roles are reversed and that you've just listened to what you've said. What advice would you give that person?
I would probably advise myself to not stop giving the information, even if it's not taken, because in the end, I can't control whether or not the person takes the information, but to make sure that I still do what I think is my best job and being my best self in providing the information, regardless of whether it's used.
And how would you go about doing that?
I think I would probably continue just to have some regular meetings, maybe try to approach things a little differently, because maybe that's the problem, is my managing up isn't being accepted because of the way I'm presenting it. So maybe I need to think of a different way, like reteaching it.
And how do you protect yourself from a learned helplessness feeling?
Well, I think if I went to the point where I'm like, well, I'm just not going to say anything anymore because nothing matters, then I know I've gotten to a point of learned helplessness. And I think that's where I'm not being my best self at that point. And I don't want to get to that point.
And so how do you protect that?
I think I protect it in trying to be more creative with the ways in which I present things and not get stuck on saying, well, I've told this person I've done this, instead of like thinking like, okay, I'm going to think of a different way to present this.
Well, and I think about that question you have on the back of your wall. How does that apply to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's my favorite quote. So I think it's, I want to make sure that I can remain my best self in the situation, regardless of whether I feel like I'm not going to put responsibility on anyone else. I'm going to control what I can control, which is my actions within this setting. I'm not going to let the environment change me, I guess is the best way to say it.
And have you explicitly talked to the person you're trying to manage in this direct of a way?
I would probably say,
Let me rephrase that. Let me rephrase it. If this person was observing this conversation, would they be surprised?
I don't think they would be surprised, but I do think I have been more direct in this conversation than I have been with that person.
Why?
I think I tiptoe around it because of the age difference. Like, I don't want to come across as this person who knows more.
And the reality is, even if you tried, so I know you, Becky, that's not in your DNA. So why would you fear that? Literally everything in your experience points the direct opposite of that. So why on earth would you fear that? And we can cut it off here, but like that's exactly what it would be. And even Becky, I know you so well. We did not have that plan. That's what's beautiful about these conversations. And you can see how that stimulates thought. Do you want to just explain what you're feeling on that side?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, it is exactly what we talked about in this presentation, which is it's coaching myself. There's no advice from Brett. There's nobody, he's never said, hey, why don't you try this? Or why don't you do this? It's more questioning like, okay, what's next? How would you do that? And then I own that information because I'm the one who came up with it. And it's mine to choose to use or not use, but it's all mine. And I think that's really powerful.
And Becky, I think we have a few more questions. And as you're about to call on those, I think that the key, when you ask people to go inside themselves and find the insight and the wisdom from their experiences, that fosters intrinsic motivation, unlike anything that I've ever witnessed before.
Yeah, totally. I think that goes back to where it's your own information, which do with it what you want. So let's go to Jasmine. Jasmine Briggs, unmute and hit us with your question.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering about that example you gave earlier when it was like obviously like a simple command and then all the letters and numbers were sort of all jumbled up. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how you like sort of close that gap to interpretation and make sure it does all come across clearly, because if you're giving that advice, you're going to think it's clear, but obviously that's not clear to others. Do you have any advice on understanding how to know if they think that's clear?
Jasmine, I'm going to ask you a question, okay?
Okay.
So I was just with a coach this past week and their season ended and they gave the team an end of year audit. And they said, what would be 3 words to describe us as a group on the field together, us as a group off the field together? And on the field, they had literally answers that were unselfish. Some people said that. And then others said selfish. Off the field said honest communication. Other people said lack of transparency. How do you process that?
It doesn't really sound like they're all on the same team, to be honest, but I guess what I would take from it is that everyone interprets things differently. I don't know if I was the manager how I would approach that, really.
And so I'm just telling you that to stimulate some thoughts. I can share with you what I did with that coach, but I'd like to hear more specifically how that, why did you ask that question?
I think I just would like to see a little bit more how obviously people interpret things so differently, but crucially, like how different it can be with the same question across a different set of people, and how you can.
Question though, Jasmine, you literally could have asked me a million questions, and you settled on that one. Why?
To how to get your point across more clearly.
And why is that important to you right now?
So that everyone's aligned and on the same page.
And scale of 1 to 10, how is that for you right now?
I'm just thinking of context of like my team. We're growing quite a lot. We're hiring. So I think that's going to be quite a big agenda coming up.
And how well do you think you're doing right now? Scale of 1 to 10.
I think we're good on the team now, but it's scale of 1 to 10, like 7, 8. But bringing on a lot of people quite quickly, it's gonna be like top of priority.
So, and what if there's like the people that you're bringing on, if there were like 2 to 3 things that they really, if there's anyone, they understand these 3 points, what are they?
Values, like our mission, and why we're doing that at the end of the day.
And why are you?
To help other sales teams.
So
That's
is
like
that
the
a mission?
Yeah, that's basically what we're doing.
So to me, it would be, there's so many different ways you can do it. I love questions because the questions take you to where they are. And then there's no assumptions made, like why guess when you can know? And so whatever you're trying to convey, I would figure out a way to have your voice not be what says it. Does that make sense? Because I would never burn bullets on just directly communicating it. I would try and figure out a way to storytell it and then ask them, what do you think when you see that? If it's a video or if it's a picture and then you can bring them into the fold and capture their imagination if you're showing something that will stimulate thought. Does that make sense? So what is your mission exactly? Like, is it literally to help sales teams? Or
yeah.
Okay, so maybe I would challenge the hell out of you on this one then, if that's okay, is I would say that would be the goal.
Okay.
And the why behind the goal, what we've found is more important than the goal itself.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I liked where you said to sort of bring it in to storytelling and then put it back on them instead of just communicating it across. Exactly. But yeah, definitely that is the goal.
And so if you could, like, everyone kind of gets the goal. The motivation is drawn from the why. And I would be zoomed into how to foster a care, a love, and then that's probably where the values come in on how you go about. So I would think why is the mission, our values is how we do it, and then what we produce is increasing sales on the team. Becky, would you like to chime in on that?
No, I think I was just going to kind of reinforce what you said about bringing it through like a picture or a video or getting people there without you explicitly telling them. One of the things that when we've had this class that I'm teaching, that's one of the things we really try to emphasize is like, can they find something that illustrates what they're trying to teach? And then you really are just trying to drill down deeper on how that person interprets it and how it relates to what you do. And I think it's been awesome. Oh, I see we're running out of time. Can we have one more question? Because there's one more good one.
All right, so Becky, we'll hit that question, but the last thing I'll say is with the USA basketball team, they had a person missing a limb that was wounded in action come into the USA basketball team and describe to them what that jersey meant to them. Those are experiential events that create a much deeper meaning around what the group is trying to do.
All right, so my question, Maria, is can we take Becky's question?
Sure. If she's still on it, then yeah, for sure.
All right, last one. You're up, Becky.
I think Maria had some insight knowledge, Becky, that Becky is already gone. So Maria, you're not as clever as you think you are.
I actually think I thought she was still on actually. I'm just worried that I'm not unmuted her, but I think I definitely have. So I'm not sure.
Hey,
you might have
we're
to
all
just
good.
read the question out, Becky, because
Yeah,
for the
okay.
recording's sake as well.
All right, we can read that out. It's a good one. How would you advise getting to know someone's reality is below the line behavior due to the misunderstanding, or is it a more deeply entrenched character trait? That's a really good question.
Wonderful question. And I wish Becky was here to give a little bit more context. I think the beauty of question asking is finding a way to ask the same question 20 different times, and then you can corroborate the answers to figure out if it's more of a one-off or if it's a deeply embedded inside their belief system. And if, as you listen to this recording in the future, you want to deconstruct that next call, I am totally willing to do that.
Well, let's talk about what we're gonna hit on the last one, because the next one is the last one. And we're going to talk about modeling, which is really, really overlooked, but super important. So we're going to talk about like the leader's example, making sure that we're not sending mixed signals, but also a really important part of this is making sure that we keep perspective as leaders and how to actually do that. So really looking forward to the next session. Can't wait to see you all again.
Thanks for hanging out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.